They shut us down. The fire trucks around here.
Shut the on my video. Why do you do your video behind?
They shut down a film set once because Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart couldn't stop arguing about who had the bigger trailer. At least, that's the version the publicists want you to believe.
This is the start of something very dangerous.
The real story is quieter, stranger, and significantly more depressing than a celebrity ego war. Because the truth is, by the time these two men started sharing posters, the argument was already over. They had both lost, not to each other, to themselves. Here is what nobody wants to say out loud. Hollywood did not ruin Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart. Hollywood gave them exactly what they asked for. It handed them the keys, the contracts, the billion-dollar franchises, and the private jets.
When?
And both men, with full awareness, with decades of hunger and ambition behind them, looked at the cost and said, yes anyway.
What?
That is not a story about an industry eating its talent. That is a story about two extraordinarily gifted performers who chose the brand over the actor and then spent the next decade wondering why. Something felt hollow. But here is what makes that tragedy worth examining. Before the algorithm, before the matching posters, before the fanny packs and the screaming and the unkillable franchise sequels, there were two men who were genuinely, undeniably special. And we need to talk about what that looked like before we talk about what replaced it. To understand Dwayne Johnson before he became a product, you have to understand the arena. Not the movie set, the arena. 20,000 people, no safety net, no second take, no director whispering adjustments in your earpiece. Just a microphone, a character, and the immediate, unforgiving verdict of a crowd that will tell you in real time whether you are compelling or whether you are finished. Professional wrestling in the Attitude Era was not sports entertainment. It was live theater with consequences. And the man who became The Rock was forged entirely inside that crucible. What WWE gave Dwayne Johnson that film school never could was a sensitivity to the room. He learned to read an audience the way a jazz musician reads a crowd, adjusting the tempo, shifting the tone, finding the moment where the energy peaks and riding it before it collapses. He brought every single one of those instincts with him when he made the jump to film.
You're telling me.
And for one brief, luminous window between 2003 and 2005, you could see them working. In the rundown, he gets beaten, badly, repeatedly. He looks exhausted and frustrated and genuinely uncertain whether he's going to survive the next scene. In Be Cool, he plays a gay bodyguard who performs a dramatic monologue from Bring It On in front of a mirror and means every single word of it. He is awkward. He is strange. He is self-aware in a way that makes you lean forward. There was a character actor living inside that extraordinary body. And for those few years, he was getting out. Then came Fast Five, and everything changed. When Dwayne Johnson walked onto that set in 2011 and introduced the world to Luke Hobbs, the response from audiences was seismic. They didn't just like him, they needed him. They needed him to be enormous and relentless and completely, cosmically invincible. And the moment he felt that need, something in his creative calculus quietly shifted. The world did not want Dwayne. The world wanted The Rock. And The Rock, it turned out, was worth considerably more money. This is the birth of what I will call the untouchable era. The era in which the performance becomes secondary to the persona. The era in which the contracts allegedly began to specify, in legally binding language, exactly how many times the character could be struck in an action sequence. Think about what that means for a moment. A man who learned his entire craft by selling for his opponents, by making the other performer look powerful, by understanding that vulnerability is the engine of all great storytelling. That man decided that vulnerability was a financial liability. He turned off the very instinct that made him extraordinary. By the time Skyscraper arrived in 2018, the formula had calcified into something almost abstract. The missing leg should have been a source of real tension. In the hands of a Bruce Willis, circa 1988, it would have been. But the brand had become so omnipotent, so structurally invincible, that no amount of duct tape or 100-story drops could manufacture a single, genuine moment of doubt. You were not watching a man fight to survive. You were watching a quarterly earnings report fulfill its projections. And then there was Black Adam. 15 years of promises. 15 years of telling the world that the hierarchy of power was about to change. What arrived on screen was a monument to the untouchable era in full collapse. Every frame was engineered for iconic stillness. Every line was delivered with the weight of a man who had not allowed himself to be surprised in over a decade. It was not a performance. It was a press release with a budget. The tragedy is not that Black Adam failed. The tragedy is that you could see exactly why. When you spend 15 years removing every variable from your image, when you sand away every rough edge and unpredictable moment and human flaw, what you are left with is not a character. You are left with a surface. And surfaces, no matter how impressively rendered, are not something an audience can feel anything for. Kevin Hart's version of this story begins in a smaller room with a brighter light and a far more specific kind of courage. Before he was the panic product. Before the jungle and the screaming and the reaction gifs and the voice acting for animated pets, Kevin Hart stood alone on a stage and told people the truth about himself. Not a sanitized, audience-tested version of the truth. The actual truth. His father's addiction. His failures as a partner. The crushing, daily reality of being a small man in a world that reads physical size as authority. He took every humiliation and held it under the spotlight and dared the audience to laugh. Which they did, because the most disarming thing a human being can do is be honest about the exact shape of their pain. Laugh at "My pain" is not just a title. It is a thesis statement. It is Hart telling you in 4 words exactly what kind of performer he was at his peak. Vulnerable by design. Deliberate in his self-exposure. In control of his own chaos. That is the version of Kevin Hart that Hollywood found. That is the engine they decided to industrialize. Because here is what Hollywood does with a tool that works. It does not study how it works. It does not ask why it works or what it costs the person wielding it. It makes a mold of it and runs it at full production capacity until the tool is identical to itself in every context, regardless of whether the context has anything to do with the original conditions that made it brilliant. The Kevin Hart loud panic product did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a genuine instinct being extracted from its source material and replicated without the supporting architecture. The vulnerability that made the screaming funny was not the screaming. The vulnerability was the honesty underneath the screaming. Without the honesty, you're left with the volume. And volume without content is just noise. By the time Ride Along arrived in 2014, the mold had been cast. Hart plays an amateur terrified of competence. He reacts to danger with his entire face and all of his respiratory system. It works, technically. It generates the required units of laughter at the required intervals. But watch it again and ask yourself, do you ever believe this person is in actual danger? Do you ever feel his fear as anything other than a scheduled delivery? The answer tells you everything about the distance between the stage and the set. The cruelest iteration of this reduction is the voice acting phase. When you hire Kevin Hart to voice a pet or a cartoon sidekick, you are making an admission. You are admitting that the human being is not the point. The instrument is the point. You want the frequency. You want the pitch and cadence of performed overwhelm. The person producing those sounds is irrelevant. That is not a collaboration with a performer. That is a licensing agreement with a noise. But here is what makes both of these stories more than cautionary fables about commerce. Here is what makes them genuinely heartbreaking. There were 2 films, one for each of them. 2 moments where the armor came off entirely, and what you saw underneath was staggering. Pain and Gain, Michael Bay directing. Not a film you would associate with the resurrection of a suppressed actor. And yet, here it is. Dwayne Johnson as Paul Doyle, a man who is massive and terrifying and catastrophically stupid and completely, irredeemably lost. He cries, he takes drugs, he loses fights, he does things with no tactical or contractual justification whatsoever. He looks like a man whose self-construction is visibly failing in real time. It is not a performance designed to make you respect him. It is a performance designed to make you understand him. And the difference between those two goals is the entire distance between a brand and an actor. Critics who had spent years writing Johnson off as a demographic delivery mechanism sat up. They wrote about range, they wrote about surprise, they used the word genuine. And then the box office numbers came in. Not bad numbers, not embarrassing numbers, but not rock-sized numbers, not franchise numbers, not four-quadrant global asset numbers. The industry looked at genuine and decided it was not worth the margin. The upside. Bryan Cranston, a man recently released from prison becoming a caretaker for someone whose body has stopped working entirely. The premise alone demands a register that the panic product has no template for. You cannot scream your way through that material. You cannot bulge your eyes at a quadriplegic man's grief and expect the scene to hold. Hart understood this. Something in him rose to meet the requirement. He was quiet. He was present. He listened on camera, which is the rarest and most revealing thing an actor can do. You could see him thinking. You could see Del Scott existing inside the frame, rather than Kevin Hart performing inside it. There is a version of Kevin Hart who follows that film with another one, like it, who builds a late career the way Robin Williams built his, using the enormous energy of comedy as fuel for something that burns slower and deeper. That version of Hart exists. The upside is the proof of it. It is sitting there on his filmography, like a door left open in a house that is otherwise locked. And here is the thing that makes all of this genuinely strange and genuinely sad. If you watch either of these men in an unguarded interview, if you catch them in a moment where the cameras are rolling but the brand management has relaxed slightly, the instincts are still there. The humor is still real. The charm is still specific and individual, rather than calibrated and corporate. They are still, underneath the mahogany and the noise, interesting human beings. Which means the loss is not that they ran out of talent. The loss is that the talent decided it could not afford to be seen. Hollywood did not steal anything from Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart. It made them an offer that was, by any rational financial metric, extraordinarily reasonable. It said, "Give us the version of you that is predictable, and we will give you everything." They accepted, and they built the cage with their own hands, with their own publicists, and their own contracts, and their own brand consultants, and they welded it shut from the inside. The Rock cannot lose a fight. Kevin Hart cannot stop screaming. Not because the scripts won't allow it, because the machine that generates the scripts is powered by the certainty that audiences will pay more for the familiar than the true. And they are not wrong. The numbers have never been wrong. The formula has never failed. Every sequel has returned the investment. Every matching poster has sold the tickets. Every fanny pack has moved the units. But drama is not built on certainty. Tension is not possible without the genuine possibility of loss. And you cannot build something an audience will remember for the rest of their lives out of a quarterly deliverable, no matter how efficiently rendered, no matter how precisely targeted, no matter how many screens it opens on simultaneously around the planet. Pain and gain and the upside are the proof that these men were never just the brand. They were always more than the algorithm. And that is precisely why the algorithm had to win. Because the market does not reward depth. It rewards reliability. And depth, real depth, is the most unreliable thing a human being can produce. They chose the private jet over the proof. And most of us would have made the same choice. That does not make it less of a loss. Two performers who understood the sell, who knew what it cost to be truly seen, who built entire careers on the honesty of their own imperfection, decided that imperfection was too expensive to maintain. And somewhere between the contracts and the sequels and the matching posters, the actors left the building. What remained was the brand, profitable, recognizable, technically flawless, and completely, permanently empty.